This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.
All right, let's get it. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Clay Ferraro along with Ira Winderman to get you caught up on everything Heat, everything NBA after the trade deadline as we get into the second half of the season. And for those of you who don't follow Ira on Twitter, you see his @ right there, Ira Heat Beat. And he has a great breakdown right now of the second half of the schedule, not just for the Heat, but kind of comparing it to what other teams have as we look towards what seed the Heat are going to finish at, you know, whether it's that one seed, heaven forbid they were to fall to the play-in, although I think thankfully they put themselves in a position where that's not what we're looking at. So we want to set up the hour of this show where we want you guys to drive this a bit. If you guys have questions, comments, make sure to drop them as we head into the second half of the season. But this is going to be a reset. This is going to be, okay, we've gotten a break. We're refreshed. We're rested. We're ready to rock. We know the Miami Heat are too. No practice today, but they're going to be getting back to practice tomorrow. So, Ira, after this All-Star break, have you had time to reflect and kind of look ahead on where this team is right now and where they could be as we look to the future?
You know, Clay, this is almost going to sound like sort of an excuse, but to a degree, I don't know for this reason, is that the standings and the way they're set up right now in the Eastern Conference, you're 2.5 games from falling to 5th place. And while it doesn't start immediately, thankfully, they're the Knicks at the Garden on Friday, at home Spurs on Saturday. But then you almost have Hell Week coming up, when you have a week where you're opening, coming back home Monday against Chicago, going to Milwaukee
crazy. Crazy. It's crazy. That
right. Going to Milwaukee on Wednesday, going to Brooklyn, coming home against Philly. So you're going to have a much better idea a week from now. We're on the show as far as how the second half Heat are competing. And here's the thing, Clay. I'm not so sure we have seen the best of other teams. I mean, look at the other teams in the East. They've been waiting to sort of find themselves. Philly's just getting started now with James Harden. That debut is still to come. We're still waiting for Ben Simmons with the Nets and, of course, Kevin Durant to come back. You have Milwaukee just made a couple of small personnel moves, but still significant with what they've done with their roster. Chicago just added Tristan Thompson. So in a way, I know what the Heat are. We see them every day. We see them all the time. I do wonder, Clay, a little bit, what's the rest of the competition? So, I mean, right now, if you were almost to say, well, the Heat are, I mean, they're tied for first, but they have the tiebreaker. But I'm not so sure they have any better chance for first place than the Bulls or the 76ers or the Bucks or maybe even the Cavaliers right now. I think in a week or so, against top-tier competition, ready for the stretch run, we'll have a much better idea of where this team stands. This team could have a great record and still finish in 5th place.
Yeah, because of the other teams that you mentioned and because of the way that those teams, to be completely honest, improved their roster as we look forward. And we talked about this last week with Brooklyn adding Ben Simmons. And it's not that Ben Simmons is a better player than James Harden. It's the fit. Philadelphia adds James Harden, who replaces somebody who wasn't even playing in Ben Simmons. And so you look at those two teams, you look at the move that Milwaukee made to bring in Serge Ibaka. I mean, Goran Dragic going to Brooklyn could eventually.
Oh, absolutely, especially with Kyrie. It's like right now, it's like you're almost asking, what's the biggest name, the biggest impact name in the NBA over the final 6 weeks of the season? And you know what's crazy, Clay? The biggest impact name in the NBA, I'm not going to put you on the spot because I'm sure you don't know where I'm going with this, is Eric Adams, the mayor of New York. Because if he allows Kyrie Irving to play home games, that's a game changer. And even if it's not when the Heat visit next Thursday, but even if it's just for the playoffs, that's a completely different, looking team all of a sudden. When you're going to have Durant and Simmons and Kyrie full-time and a little more Goran, maybe Joe Harris coming back. So I think even the vaccine mandate in New York will be an impact also. So there's still a lot to be played out here. And it'll be interesting to see how much of a climb, if any bit of a climb, that the Nets can make. I think also what'll be interesting is this. Who really wants the number 1 seed? Who's going to go all out? Clay, you referenced the breakdown I did in the Sun Sentinel on the remaining schedule. The Heat have 5 back-to-backs left. Do you think they're going to play all their veterans on both ends of all 5 of those back-to-backs?
No, of course not. And which is, now I say that because I felt like, I felt that way at the beginning of the year, but then I saw them start to play their veterans on both ends of a back-to-back. Obviously, the NBA kind of encourages you to play the guys in the games that are nationally televised. You have the back-to-back with Milwaukee and then Brooklyn right,
That's
coming
great.
up
Yeah.
where I think the Brooklyn game, the second night, is the one that's nationally televised. But do you really want to tell those guys that you have to sit them for the game against Milwaukee? So that's going to be the tough one.
And
And get some of
there's
these.
zero chance they're going to do that.
No.
Eric Spoelstra always tells us we're not doing that, and then he does that. So
Yeah,
you can even
yeah.
see this back-to-back at New York, get yourself back in stride, then you come home for San Antonio. God bless San Antonio, but they're somewhat limited, even though they do have DeJounte Murray back. And you're absolutely right the following week, Clay. The Milwaukee game, that's the game right now. The Heat hold the 2-1 season series lead. That's a
Yep.
tiebreaker game. There's not going to be a tiebreaker game with Brooklyn. There's no way that Brooklyn's going to catch up that amount of games, get into a first-place tie with the Heat, and then you have to go to the tiebreaker. The Heat's up 2-0 on Brooklyn. They have 2 games left, one in Brooklyn, one later in the season at FTX Arena. So they're probably going to get that tiebreaker. Those are the different games. Chicago on Monday. The Heat are up 2-0 on the Bulls with 2 games left. You win that, you get the tiebreaker. As Clay, the multiple team tiebreakers, you make a mini subset of standings. Those wins mean more. A win against Chicago, a win against Milwaukee, a win against Philadelphia mean more than one game. Believe me, Eric Spoelstra might not tell you this, but he has little circles in his office of what means a little more, and those games will mean more. So you know what? The Heat will come up with injuries. You and I will look at the injury report the night before, and you go, wow, I didn't realize that Kyle still needs his wisdom teeth pulled, and that's why he's not playing on Thursday. I mean, they'll just come up with something. And then we'll write they're going to rest, and the Heat will go, we're not resting players. We don't do that. Yeah, because on national television games, you can't do that. It's going to get very interesting medically.
Yeah, and also looking ahead to that game, who knows if Kevin Durant's going to be able to play? And obviously, that would be, if you're looking for places to steal a chance to take a night off. I mean, obviously, Brooklyn showed here that even though the Heat got a big lead, Kyrie Irving can single-handedly shoot you back into a game.
And he won't
but
be
yeah,
playing
so
in
those
that
are the
game,
types of decisions that the Heat are going to have to make going down the stretch. Some of the comments so far, Arcadio, I really appreciate that. Good morning, Omar. I love how everybody's giving Sean a hard time for this. Oscar, we are live, so whatever questions you want to ask, go for it. Great or good, home court advantage in the playoffs. Good morning, Thomas. Yeah, I think it's home court advantage is important, and we've talked about this, but health is more important. And we're getting to the point in the season where you're looking at the remaining schedule, and it's a few things stick out. Matchups stick out. Obviously, you want to get these guys and keep them healthy. I do think it matters that the Heat have more home games remaining than any of the other contenders, and it's not even close. They've got 16 home games left versus 9 on the road. And a lot of these other teams have some road trips coming up. The Heat have already they're finished with all of their road trips. They're big, long road trips. So when you're talking about like the wear and tear of a schedule, I know Eric Spoelstra likes these long road trips from a team bonding, team building perspective, but I think we're past that with this team. I think it's important to have these guys around the trainers down here in Miami and be able to get the treatment that they need without having to travel and deal with swelling in knees and things like that. So I think things play out nicely from that perspective. But I want to go back to your point, Ira, that the other teams in the league that you're looking at their schedules and who's coming up on this schedule, they got better, and they got significantly better at the deadline, a lot of them. So you compare that with the Heat, and are you comfortable with the Heat not doing anything massive at the trade deadline, maybe adding a closer to healthy Victor Oladipo, and that being your big acquisition, and looking at the rest of the scheduling and saying, okay, yeah, this team is still where they need to be when it comes to a contending perspective, not a challenging perspective, a contending perspective?
And again, I would go almost incrementally position by position. So in other words, there's no MJ out there. There's no player the Heat were going to get with their draft position and what their assets that they were going to make the super big move, nor do I think they have to, because I'm not sure there's a better center for who they want to be than Bam Adebayo. I'm not sure there's a better backup center for the physical moments that they need than a Dwayne Dedmon. I'm not sure there are better three-point shooters out there than Duncan Robinson and Max Strus. I'm not so sure there's not a crunch time, go time, bullying, get to the foul line player like a Jimmy Butler, followed up by a Kyle Lowry that can get you those baskets when you need it. So when you look at what the Heat might need, I don't think the trading deadline was going to give them a starter. like it did for Brooklyn when it brought in Ben Simmons, like it did for Philadelphia when they brought in James Harden. That was not going to be their play. It was not going to be even the kind of play, the small moves, the subtle moves made, with Karis LeVert by the Cleveland Cavaliers, a rotation player. The Heat's rotation is so good, you've got to be a pretty damn good player to crack it. So where are you cracking it? Again, starting lineup, we can argue the Robinson thing another time. Let's take a week off from that. But starting lineup, Bam Adebayo, PJ Tucker, Duncan Robinson, Jimmy Butler, Kyle Lowry works very well. You don't want to mess with that. Then you got Tyler Hero coming back from the knee. You have Dwayne Dedmon in there. Then eighth guy, and that's probably where it starts, probably Caleb Martin now because he's the best two-way player. Hopefully Victor Oladipo because he might be a better two-way player. And then we're 9 deep. So where were you going to add? Who were you going to bump? And the bump was always going to be if you were going to replace Duncan Robinson, if you were going to make a big trade, a $15 million trade. And really no one made that this year without giving up a major asset for someone like that. As a matter of fact, I'll put it to you this way, Clay. Do you necessarily think if the Heat could have gotten Karis LeVert, that he would be your starter for what this team needs ahead of Duncan Robinson?
No, because I think chemistry matters. And I
Right.
think that you've been able to see how Bam and Duncan play together.
Yes.
And look, we look at it as, oh, well, Duncan magically shoots better when Bam is out there. And the chemistry is helpful with that. But it's not just that. It's the gravity that Duncan creates. Bam is used to being in certain spots with Duncan on the floor. So it helps Bam too. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that we've seen this like incredibly aggressive Bam Adebayo since he's come back and been playing with Duncan Robinson. It's the type of Bam that we saw earlier in the season before the knee became an issue. We talk about the being out because of the thumb injury.
Right.
The knee was a real problem for him before that thumb. And we even said at the time, look, like you never want to see anybody get hurt. But the blessing in disguise with that, and I emphasize in disguise,
Right.
is that it gave him time to let that knee heal close to fully. And you told the story here that every time he went out there before a game and there was a little bit of swelling, they would have to go back and measure the amount of swelling in the knee to determine whether or not he was even going to be able to play that night. That's clearly not having to happen anymore, and that's a good thing. So to go back to your original question, no, not for a Karis LeVert. Now, if you're looking at some of the other names that were being tossed around, I don't even, PJ Washington wouldn't have even been somebody that would have been that
I'm talking about the players who were actually traded. In other words, the speculation is a wonderful thing, Clay.
Gotcha.
We don't really know if Charlotte was desperate to move PJ Washington because they have his extension coming up and they were worried about it. So my point being is, in the Heat starting lineup, you know that Bam likes to have the ball, especially now. He's being more aggressive. He's looking at the rim. Jimmy certainly likes to have the ball. He's always looking at the rim. Kyle likes to have the ball, even if it's not for scoring, it's for playmaking. You can't have too many like to have the balls. Duncan Robinson doesn't need plays called for him. He moves great without the ball. PJ Tucker doesn't need the ball. He stands in the corner. He'll make 50% of his threes in that shape. So that chemistry matters also. It's why you can go a little sideways sometimes when Tyler Hero's in the starting lineup. He does need the ball. He does look at the rim. You have to find those sort of units there. So from the players who were traded at the deadline, it's not like the Heat missed out. It's not like they could have had X, Y, or Z. Now we're looking at the buyout deadline. I had no issue if they would have made a move for Goran Dragic, but I could see Goran sitting back and going, I might not even play there. I've seen the Heat do this before, bring in a Luke Babbitt at the buyout deadline, and then he doesn't wind up playing. He knew as long as the mandate remained in place in New York and Kyrie couldn't play home games, that he'd have at least half the home schedule, half the home playoff schedule. So I understand that also. Again, the buyout deadline is March 1st. That's next Tuesday, I believe. As long as you were waived by a team by then, you're eligible to be signed until the end of the regular season and be playoff eligible. So by the time we do our show next week on the Slomin's Home Security Inside the Paint, we'll have a much better idea of the buyout candidates. Maybe someone shakes free. Maybe someone at the bottom of the standings. I listed in my story 5 teams playing for the lottery: Houston, Oklahoma City, Orlando, Detroit, and Indiana. Maybe some guy on an expiring contract and one of those teams say, screw this. I don't need to spend the next 6 weeks for my team wanting to lose to get to the lottery. So I think you might see better names shaking out in coming days where guys said, you know what? Instead of just giving up the minimum like Goran did and giving him back $800,000, I like how I throw these numbers around because I've covered the NBA so long. I'll give up $1 million to go somewhere else. So I think you still might see a better name where next Wednesday when we're talking, you could say to yourself, well, now this is interesting because they can sign X, Y, and Z. Right now, the buyout market does nothing to really say, hey, we've got to go out and get DJ Augustine. Now we know that Dennis Schroeder, the Rockets are saying they're probably going to keep him for the rest of the season. They say that now, but maybe if Dennis Schroeder gives up a little bit more, they don't say that. I think we'll have a much better idea by next week. But let's face it, Clay, as we get ready for our next segment here, the Heat did not trade KZ Okpala and go through all of that to open a roster spot to do nothing. They will do something.
I'm reading Scummy's comments. I was about to say Scummy made an interesting point, and it was one that we could talk about. And then he said that the Heat are like the Kerry Kittles, Jason Kidd Nets, only worse. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'd go there. Although, some of those teams were actually pretty good. Some of the comments that are really good. Oscar brought up a question. It's one that, I know all Heat fans are asking, which is where does Omer Yurtseven fit in as far as the rotation goes? And, we're talking about where the upgrades and things like that. And you're talking about the rotation. Well, Omer's name didn't even come up when you're going through that. Why is that? Help explain to people why it is that when you have a Dwayne Dedmon and, of course, Bam Adebayo, Omer Yurtseven becomes, I'm not going to say expendable, but the minutes go down drastically and without really much hope of them going up, barring injury or foul trouble.
Because in the playoffs, the game slows. Because in the playoffs, the game becomes more about defense. Because of the style the Heat play, that's where Omer is still lacking. Omer's time will come after the season when Dwayne Dedmon's contract expires, when the Heat have more time to work on changing toward that style. He's still going to have a big future for this team. But if you're asking me or other NBA executives and scouts, do they think Omer Yurtseven is a playoff rotation player? I don't think anyone thinks that now. I think he needs a little bit more polish. Now, if Dwayne Dedmon's not available, fine. Matter of fact, Clay, 2 years ago, it seems like a century ago, 2020 playoffs, Bam Adebayo was injured and can't play, and the Heat started Myers Leonard. Well, now they can start Omer Yurtseven. That's a huge upgrade. So at least they can have that in their back pocket if needed, but it's not something where when Eric Spoelstra lines up his playoff rotation, Omer's name is in there. He is break open in case of emergency. His future's ahead of him. His future's a next season kind of thing. This was a wonderful step this year. Now he has to take that bigger step off season next year.
There's a question, too, about the starting lineup, and you kind of gloss over that, but I want to be clear when everybody is healthy. And this means, Tyler Hero's knee is obviously feeling better, and Victor Oladipo. And again, with Vic, let's just assume whatever healthy Victor Oladipo is going to be, whether that's 80% of the best Victor Oladipo that we've seen or whatever it is. The starting lineup for this team, I think you and I are on the same page with this. It remains intact. It is Kyle Lowry, Duncan Robinson, Jimmy Butler, PJ Tucker, Bam Adebayo, correct?
It is, except, and this, I know we're getting long in the segment, so we can move on to this in the next segment. Eric Spoelstra has always had a dynamic change just before the playoffs. A couple of years, Kendrick Nunn was a starter. Then all of a sudden, Goran Dragic was brought out of mothball. So I would never say anything is locked in with Eric Spoelstra. Again, if you're a top 6 seed, you get a week off before the playoffs. The Heat will finish their schedule. I think it's April 10th on a Sunday in Orlando. The earliest they will play is next Saturday. That lets the mad professor go into his lab at 601 Biscayne and Eric Spoelstra cook something up. So while I think it stays intact, I certainly can see Eric Spoelstra saying, well, you know what? When you look at our matchups, we got Toronto in the first round. We got Cleveland potentially in the second round. I think this might work a little better. I think we might need a little more size. I think maybe a Caleb Martin would work a little better to give us someone to guard Siakam in this round, guard Markin in the next round. So I wouldn't summarily dismiss it, only because we've seen this from Eric Spoelstra before. He has changed his starting lineups in the playoffs. So I wouldn't rule anything out, but if you're sort of putting out your, here's today's betting odds, I would bet on the current starting lineup until I see reason to bet otherwise.
Yeah, and I think even going back to those teams, you mentioned the Kendrick Nunn team, and it was kind of like you just had this feeling all along that it was better if Goran Dragic was in the – like it was almost like they were trying to steal minutes of rest with Goran. It was easier to manage his minutes coming off the bench. And there was also a decent chemistry with that first group. With this team, like I can't see a reason, a need to pull any of the individuals out of that lineup unless you do see something matchup specific. Like you said, like the Duncan Robinson situation, we love the gravity. We love the fact that he's pulling guys away. So I think that makes it different. A lot more to get to. All of your questions and comments, which are great. Plus, Ira, I want to ask you this. Do the Heat have a new closer down the stretch? All that. Plus, please smash that like button for us. It does us a big favor. That and a lot more coming up next right here on Inside the Paint.